The next 2 weeks are going to be critical for the Louisville Cardinals college football playoff hopes. We'll explain why coming up on today's episode of the show.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Card Nation, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into this Monday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. I want to take this time to personally thank you all, as I always do, for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, Locked On Louisville, free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week, your team every day. Now, today's episode of the show is brought to you by 5hourenergy.com. Go to 5hourenergy.com and use the promo code LOCKEDONCFB to receive 20% off of your order. Louisville football is back following the weird early week 3 bye. 2 key weeks that will be critical for the Louisville Cardinals college football playoff hopes. 2 games against Georgia Tech and Notre Dame. Louisville needs to do well in both of these. We'll discuss, just how good is Georgia Tech coming up on the second part of the show, and then we will wrap things up by diving into a Monday mailbag. So we're finally back. It felt really, really weird. I'm not sure that there's been a time in my life where Louisville has had a bye week literally on the 3rd week of the season. I know that there were some interesting circumstances that, were the reason behind Louisville having that early bye. And Jeff Brom even said it in his press conference on Monday. He was like, yeah, it's kind of weird, But overall, you play the cards that you were dealt. And the cards that Louisville was dealt featured 2 non-Power 5 opponents that they took care of business against early on, right? You covered the spread against both Austin Peay and Jacksonville State. You handle business. That's all you can do. We talked about controlling what you can control. They've done that. They go through the bye week, and now they set themselves up with the final 10 games looking to get back to double-digit wins in the regular season and also looking to make that inaugural 12-team college football playoff. Well, these next 2 weeks are critical for the Cardinals' hopes and chances of getting there. Now, I know that if you want to play this from a technical aspect, every week is critical. Yes, that is 100% true. But we're breaking this down in the schedule. We're not trying to look too far in advance, right? We try to take things week by week. The way that I've looked at it is I've taken it in sections of 4 games each time. And I remember talking about the first 4-game part of the schedule saying that, Louisville has to win the first 2 games. And then they, at the very worst, split the next 2. Put it this way, you cannot lose to both of these teams. You have to at least split. You could argue that to really throw your name into the playoff hat, you need to win both of them to start out the season 4-0. I won't disagree with that. I'm just, covering all bases here, suggesting that bottom line, you can't lose both of them. Ideally, you can make a case either way. It's probably better that you lose on the road at Notre Dame and win at home against Georgia Tech than vice versa, although there might be some benefits to having that road win at Notre Dame, but then you still lose to Georgia Tech. So put it this way, I say all this because I'm looking at the rest of the schedule here. And part of me believes that Louisville at 10-2 is going to get into the college football playoff. But the other part of me believes, we've seen the perception of the ACC sort of drive the college football playoff to do some pretty historic things, like leave out a 13-0 FSU team last year. Now, it doesn't help that the Seminoles are 0-3 this year, but don't let that cloud your memory from the fact that FSU was the first undefeated Power 5 team to miss the 4-team playoff. Actually, they're the only Power 5 team, considering the 4-team playoff is no longer around. So the perception of the conference, it's not great. FSU being really, really bad to start the season does not help whatsoever. And I don't care what Clemson or, well, I mean, honestly, Clemson lost to Georgia, so not really much so Clemson, but Boston College or Georgia Tech or any of these other ACC teams have done, because it's not enough. The perception of the ACC is still not good. So 10-2, you still might be right there on the fence line, right? You might be in that uncomfortable conversation that the College Football Playoff Committee has to have as to whether or not they're going to include a 10-2 ACC team over perhaps a 9-3 SEC or Big Ten team. Because at the moment, the majority of the top 10 teams in the country are SEC squads. They're going to beat up on each other, and I can almost guarantee you that there's going to be at least one, maybe even a couple of 9-3 SEC teams that people are going to look at, and they're going to place a 10-2 ACC squad right up next to each other and say, ooh, I don't know. But I do feel confident that a 10-2 Louisville team that doesn't win the conference. Let me go ahead and point that out there. If you win the conference championship game, it doesn't matter. It's a moot point because you get an automatic bye into the second round of the playoff. But we're assuming that Louisville has to at least win 10 regular season games. I don't think that 9 gets you in. I think you might be right there, just depending on who you lose to. But I'm looking at the rest of the schedule, and we're operating under the assumption that Louisville has to win 10 regular season games to get to the playoff. Maybe there are some circumstances to where they go 9-3, but the two of the 3 losses are non-conference opponents, and maybe you get to the AC championship game, but then you would still have to win it. So, again, I don't think that you can get to the playoff with 9 wins unless you win the championship game of the conference. So, to get to 10 wins, obviously, you can only lose 2. I'm looking at the schedule in the portions of 4, and I'm looking down the line against opponents like Miami that you're playing at home. You've got road games against Boston College, who has shown to be able to compete with some top teams like they did with Missouri. You have the road game at Clemson. And then you have the game at Kentucky, and there's a question in the mailbag that I think really ties into this discussion, but I don't think that that's going to be as easy of a game as some Louisville fans might be led to believe it's going to be at the moment. So that's why I say you have to, at the very worst, split, because then you give yourself a little bit less of margin for error, but you do have the opportunity to still lose one more game and be able to get to the college football playoff, right? If you lose both of these games, you're going to have to pretty much run the table the rest of the way. And it makes it pretty interesting because the ACC is sort of in a really weird spot. Like, you don't even know who's at the top of the conference. Outside of, truthfully, Miami and Louisville are the top 2 teams in the conference. And others suggesting that not to be the case, I feel like it is pretty interesting to hear that because, I mean, you look at the rest of the conference and maybe Boston College is up there. Maybe you think Georgia Tech is up there. Maybe it's Syracuse. I just feel like at this moment, it's Miami and Louisville with Clemson right after that. Remember the tier list of last week? Miami, tier number 1, tier number 2 with Louisville and Clemson, and then the rest are below that. So, put it this way, you can't lose 2 here because that means that you would have – now, can they go on the road and beat Clemson, BC, and UK? Yeah, I mean, they can. Can they also beat Miami? Can and will are 2 different entities, right? So, I know that both of these are winnable games. And don't take this tone as me suggesting that they're not going to be 4-0 heading into October, because I definitely think that there is an opportunity for them to do that. And I think that, honestly, the more games that are played, the more confident that I feel that they will go 2-0. But I'm saying, as a means of conversation, the Cardinals cannot afford to have worse than a split in these next 2 games. That's why I say these 2 weeks are crucial for the college football playoff hopes, because if you lose both of the games, you put yourself in a position where you really can't mess up anymore. If you win one of the 2, it's okay because it's not the end of the world, but it shows that you still have to sharpen up and start to improve for the remainder of the year. But also, it can help the team's college football playoff hopes because, for starters, you're still undefeated. You're going to rise up the rankings. If you win both of those games, that includes a road win at a ranked Notre Dame team, assuming that Notre Dame comes into this game ranked, then you're going to continue to rise up the polls. Louisville currently sitting at number 19, I believe. I'm not sure if the AP polls have been out yet to include Louisville at any point, but you would rise up into the rankings, right? I honestly think if you win these next 2 games, you're fairly close to the top 10, going into that matchup with SMU. So I know that I've talked a lot about, well, these 2 games could hurt you. They could definitely help you as well. You stay undefeated. You're 4-0. You've overcome some challenges. You have won those games, and that's key as you sort of head into the back portion of the schedule. So very winnable games. The issue is it's challenging to tell how good each of the next 2 opponents are. We start with Georgia Tech. It's finally game week for the Cardinals. Georgia Tech is the ACC opener for the Cardinals. And this is a weird one to try to, analyze the matchup here. And we're going to tell you exactly why that is coming up on the next segment of Locked On Louisville. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by 5-Hour Energy. If you want to get in shape but you're having trouble staying motivated, make 5-Hour Energy shots part of your lifestyle and get the energy boost you need to get fit. We all know sometimes you don't want to go to the gym. You need to take a 5-Hour Energy shot to give you that feeling of alertness so you can get to the gym and max out. With 0 sugar and a convenient portable size, it's the perfect pick-me-up for getting stuff done. The 5-Hour Energy website has flavors galore. My favorite is grape and berry. I'm starting to like Tropical Burst a lot. They have watermelon. Simply put, there's a flavor for everyone. On the site, you have the option to build your own 12 or 24 pack. You choose the flavors and it's delivered right to your doorstep. If you go to 5hourenergy.com, that's the number 5, followed by ourenergy.com, and get some 5-Hour Energy product today, you can use my promo code LOCKEDONCFB to receive 20% off your order. This offer is only valid until September 30th. On one order and cannot be used with other promotions. The code is not good on subscription orders, so you need to go to 5hourenergy.com today. Louisville fans, thanks again for making Locked On Louisville your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the show is free on all streaming services 5 days a week, your team every day. It is the ACC opener for your squad, week 4. Technically, in the grand scheme of things, 3rd game for the Cardinals. They'll go up against Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech has sort of a weird start to the season where they opened up with what seemed to be like a really good win against Florida State in Ireland, but with Florida State's skid that has left one believing, well, just how good of a win was it? They defeated Georgia State the next week, 35-12. It wasn't really all that convincing, but a win is a win. Week 3, they went down pretty significantly to Syracuse on the road in their respective, well, actually not their ACC opener. It was their first respective road game, I should say. And their comeback fell a little short. They lost 31-28 to Syracuse, and they demolished VMI over the weekend down in Atlanta, 59-7. So Georgia Tech rolling into the 502 with a 3-1 record. They're 1-1 in conference play. And I'll be honest with you, all throughout the preseason, I identified this opponent as one of the possible trap games. It was the number 2 trap game. Number 1 was SMU, and boy, was I completely wrong on that one. But when Georgia Tech beat Florida State, I'm like, y'all should have listened to me. And now, after 3 more games that they've played, I'm sitting here and I'm like, was I right? Because, they've shown some really solid things, but again, nothing too awful convincing, and they lost against Florida State. I don't really like to look at statistical numbers to be able to tell the tale this early in the season because the level of competition among the country, like amongst the national landscape, it's completely different. Like Louisville's played 2 non-Power 5 teams. Some teams just haven't been tested yet, and Louisville's one of them. Georgia Tech has faced more of a challenge than others. You look at their numbers across the board in total offense, total defense, rushing yards, passing yards, rushing yards allowed, passing yards allowed, scoring offense, scoring defense. Like they're not top 30 in any of those metrics. Some of that can realistically be pointed to other teams. Like Tennessee leads the nation with like over 60 points a game scoring. That's not going to stay the way it is. Louisville is top 10 in the country in a bunch of metrics because of the level of competition they play. Will they stay that way? That's still to be determined. So I really have a hard time tying in statistics as a justifiable means to determining whether or not Georgia Tech is good or not. So what I ultimately was able to come to terms with was that I believe that Georgia Tech can beat Louisville. I think Georgia Tech is a formidable, solid opponent. Are they going to contend for the ACC? I don't believe so. Is Louisville the better team? They are. FanDuel, one of the title sponsors of the show that we'll talk to you about here in just a couple minutes, right now on Monday, the line for that game is Louisville minus 10.5. That's a very, very sizable margin for this game. Like if you're betting I would put it this way. I'm not touching the spread. Minus 10.5 is a little bit too much for me. Can they win by double digits? Of course they can. But this is a Georgia Tech team that I think is going to be good enough to still give you fits. Like one thing that they do well offensively is they have a quarterback who can extend plays and extend drives with his leg. And that's been one of the main concerns that we talked about on this show is how effective are they going to be in containing mobile quarterbacks or quarterbacks that can extend drives. They're going to be put to the test when Haynes King steps foot in Cardinal Stadium coming up in just under a week. So offensively, they really haven't. I mean, they're scoring 36.5 points per game. Now, most of that comes from VMI and Georgia State. Like, they didn't score over 30 against either Syracuse or Florida State. Haynes King, at the moment, is completing about 76% of his passes. He's got 6 touchdowns to 1 interception. They're averaging 5.6 yards on the ground. Jamal Haynes is their leading rusher at the moment. Haynes King is right behind him. He's got 3 touchdowns on the ground. So one of the main keys that Louisville is going to have to do is defend the run well. And thankfully for us, that is something that Louisville does at a pretty high rate. So the offense is, I wouldn't say one-dimensional, but if you force them into third and long situations, I think you're going to put yourself in a very optimal standpoint. Defensively speaking, again, this is a team that gave up 31 points to Syracuse. They held Georgia State and VMI to under 2 touchdowns. Florida State has had some really tough offensive performances. So Georgia Tech is one of those teams that we might not know how good they are until they start that game against Louisville. So my whole thing is I believe that Louisville is the better team. They are. I think they're the better team. I think they have the better offense. I think they have the better defense. I think they have the better playmakers. I think that them being at home definitely helps out a ton. But you saw last year, if you sleepwalk at any point during this game, even if it's just for a quarter, you can put yourself in some huge danger, which is what Louisville did last year. Now, thankfully, they used a huge second half to win the game. Handle business against the Yellow Jackets. Execute your game plan. Control what you can control. And play at the high level that we know you can play. And I think that Louisville wins this game. I don't know if it's by 10.5 points. but I do think that the Cardinals have the potential to do so. But it's just a matter of containing Haynes King, limiting the big time plays that you go defensively, and being being the offensive team that we know you can be with the personnel you have. So Georgia Tech, really tough to tell. Handle business, being the better team, and you should come out victorious. There's going to be a lot of preview for the Yellow Jackets coming up this week, but to conclude the show, we will dive into a Monday mailbag, answer some good questions that you all have introduced, and we'll do that coming up on the final segment of this Monday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Speaking of FanDuel, right, we talked about Louisville being a 10.5-point favorite on Monday over Georgia Tech. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little different for you now through this weekend, September 22nd. All FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. With the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Just visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. Final segment of this Monday edition of Locked On Louisville, diving into the mailbag. Some great questions that you all asked. I do want to sort of give some housekeeping notes for the scheduling and programming of the show. I will be out of town next week from Monday afternoon to Friday evening, so there won't be 5 episodes next week. We're going to try to deviate it to where there's probably going to be about 4 episodes this week. We'll have Georgia Tech post-game recap show. We'll have 1 to 2 Notre Dame previews. And then once I get back on Friday evening, not this Friday evening, but next Friday evening, everything will be business as usual. We'll recap the Notre Dame game and moving on. But I just wanted to give you a heads up on how scheduling is going to be a little bit different, just so you don't get alarmed. So be sure to look out for that. So diving into the mailbag, a lot of great questions that you all have answered. The first one was sort of what we talked about with Kentucky earlier. With Kentucky's close loss to Georgia, does it take away or does it change your perception of that game in late November? No, I think Mark Stoops, if he's still the head coach of Kentucky, is going to have this team ready. One thing he does better than a lot of coaches out there is he gets his team ready for a rivalry game, no matter how good or bad they are. So that game will be circled on Kentucky's schedule. I don't care if they are 1-9 at that point or 1-10 at that point. You're going to get Kentucky's best shot. He has those guys ready to go, juiced and amped up immediately. So, no, it doesn't change anything. I think, if anything, it just shows you that they are an SEC team that's recruited really well, and they have the athletes to make things really challenging, and they did so for Georgia. So my stance on the matter has not changed. I still think that's going to be a tough game regardless. Is it one that Louisville should win? Probably. Will they? Depends on how well they come into that game. So London Jameson had his official visit this weekend. How would you assess Louisville's chances? Well, the 4-star small forward in the 2025 class recently cut his list to 3, Louisville, Alabama, and Kansas. It seems like it's a 2-team race between Louisville and Alabama. Unfortunately, it feels like the Cardinals are the less likely of the 2 choices. It feels like if you were to make a decision on September 16th, that he would ultimately choose Alabama, is what I'm being led to believe. Could that change in the near future? We'll see. Only time will tell, but unfortunately at the moment it feels like Alabama is clearly in the driver's seat in this recruitment. So back to the football side of things. Do you still think that Louisville will have a better chance to lose to Notre Dame, Miami, or Clemson? I think I understand the question. I guess it's, who do you think that they're going to lose to if they do lose to them? Who do you think that it's going to be the toughest game? Had an episode on this last week. I think it's going to be Clemson, but I'm going to put Clemson off to the side right now. Miami and Notre Dame. You're on the road against Notre Dame. You're at home against Miami. I still think the Hurricanes are the tougher opponent. Notre Dame seems to be a little bit banged up. Another offensive lineman out for the year, a defensive end out for the year. I know that the Irish demolished Purdue, but I still think that Miami is pound for pound the best team on the Louisville schedule at the moment. So I'm going to go with Miami, but Notre Dame's not going to be an easy opponent. And that leads us into the next question. Does your stance on Notre Dame change? This was the same person that posed that question. I'll let him submit two mailbag questions. Does your stance on the Notre Dame game change with how they handled Purdue this weekend? No. Again, you're going up to South Bend. It's going to be a challenging place to play. Marcus Freeman is going to have his guys ready for that game. I mean, you look at the loss to Northern Illinois. Obviously, offense was not great against A&M. Offense was not great. And you look at this game against Purdue. Riley Leonard didn't really throw the ball all that much. He was 11 of 16, 112. Steve, I think it's Angeli, was 6 of 9 for 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. They had 216 yards on 26 total throws. They ran the ball a ton, 43 for 364, 8.5 on the ground for 6 touchdowns. Riley Leonard had 11 for 103 touchdowns. My stance on the matter does not change. You have to defend the run because that's what Notre Dame does. That's what Riley Leonard does best. Is he's not going to be a guy that throws the ball down the field. A lot of his routes are going to be short, intermediate routes at best for the most part. You have to keep them in front of you, obviously, but at the same time, you're going to likely stack the box against Notre Dame and force them to be uncomfortable and throw the football, because that's basically how you beat them. And Northern Illinois basically says, like, look, if you stop the run, you stop Notre Dame. And that's going to be the key here for Louisville, is that if you stop the run, you force Notre Dame into tough situations. And if you're able to score at a decently high level, this is a very winnable game on the road. And it's not an easy place to play. It's not a bad team you're going up against. I think it's a good Notre Dame team that just kind of overlooked Northern Illinois. And they showed against Purdue, is like, look, I mean, we're not this pushover Notre Dame team. Like, we still can beat Power 5 teams by a lot. Now, I know Purdue's not the greatest, but at the end of the day, I still think my stance really didn't change on it with Purdue. Like, if anything, it confirmed it. You let them run all over you, they're going to beat you. And it could get ugly if you just let them just go right down the field. So I think both of these next 2 games are very winnable games. You just have to execute the game plan. For Louisville to go 2-0, they must do this. You can only choose one answer. They must score more points than Georgia Tech and Notre Dame, respectively. I mean, to beat the team you're playing, you have to score more points than them. Or you hold them to less points than you have. That was a tough one. That's a tough one because it's likely not going to be one thing. But with Haynes King and Riley Leonard, I think it's containing the mobile quarterbacks. If you are able to limit the effectiveness of King and Leonard on the ground, I think that, again, you force both offenses to be not themselves to a T. They get a little bit uncomfortable. And that's the thing, is I think that Louisville wins both games. If I have to say one thing, it's because they effectively contain the mobile quarterbacks. So that is going to wrap up this Monday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Everyone have a great day. We'll see you right back here